Hi everyone, this is Ashley with C Marina Digitals. I'm going to do a tutorial to show you how to use the new Fine Art hanging canvas backdrops in Photoshop. I'm going to show you the way that I do it, and then I'm also going to show, I've seen it circulating, couple different edits circulating on different ways to do this, but I also want to show a way that is going to be a little bit harder for you to blend if you end up editing it in a certain way. I've just seen this edit a few times now, and it's going to be difficult to blend if the backdrop is even a little bit different from the color that you are using. I have a few different ones open that I'm going to edit with. First one I'm going to do is on a green canvas. Now, of course, you always want to try to use a similar color background. Same thing for like newborn composites. You obviously want to have them on like a similar color and tone layer, but if you're not doing it with the exact same color, it can obviously be a little tricky. I have open a blue one that I'm going to be doing and a gold that I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to show first the edits that I've seen circulating. This is a way that can work to do it, but it's going to highly depend on the colors in your image versus the colors in the digital backdrop that you're trying to use. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to select all, edit and copy, and edit and paste into the image that I'm using. And I'm going to lower the opacity on here so I can kind of see where I'm placing her in the backdrop. This looks like a pretty good size here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the opacity back up. I'm going to come over to my quick selection tool and select subject. Photoshop is getting really good with this, but you still want to zoom in to make sure that it is selecting. See, there's part of her hair up here that wasn't selected. You just want to make sure that it's selecting every part. See, it didn't select all the dress down here. Okay, zoom back out, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a layer mask, and as you can see, it is now just the subject on the backdrop. So the edits that have been seen going around, you would just take this is definitely a quicker way, at about 20 to 25% opacity, white brush, soft, and then just go in and kind of paint off the subject to add your shadow here and your shadow to the floor. Now this is where it starts to get a little tricky. If you can absolutely do it like this if your backdrop matches very well to your subject, but if you zoom in here and I could use a lower brush and I could keep brushing this in here to just keep trying to add shadow, but you're gonna lose the texture here that you have over here in the backdrop. Also, if you're trying to brush off of the entire floor, I'm just gonna bring in my brush here. The initial backdrop I was using does not extend all the way over here, so I would not be able to do that across the whole floor unless you wanted to flatten it at the end and go in and clone that. But now, as you see, if I want to brush off, I'm going to be brushing her off as well. So that's one reason why I would not want to use that way of doing it. And then also, if we zoom in here, it did easily add shadows, but again, you're losing that texture. You're losing that texture to the backdrop as you brush the original backdrop back on. And this, it could work for this image, but as you can see, like the initial image, I'm gonna go ahead and invert this here so you can see, was very like a dull, dark, like hunter green, and this backdrop is like a brighter, more vibrant green with some gold tones in it. So it's not, if you had a very similar backdrop, this would absolutely work other than having to tweak with the shadows a little bit. But it's going to be easier for you to take just the subject into the image and add shadows yourself. I know adding shadows can be difficult, but it's something that I believe that every photographer should learn to do if they're going to be working with composites anyways. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that layer completely. I'm going to go back to my image here, and I'm going to go to my quick selection tool and select subject. Again, I'm going to make sure that everything I want is selected. Okay, and then I'm going to edit, copy, and edit and paste into my image. Go ahead and resize if needed or wanted. Oh, look at that. Go back. There was a part of the dress that didn't get selected here. Okay, there we go. Copy and paste. Resize. Okay, so now, as you can see, it's just her still again, but there's no way to just brush on the other backdrop. You're going to need to add shadows. So I'm just going to create another layer above the background. I'm going to change it to multiply blending mode. Also, when you do it this way, it allows you to change the color of the shadows that you're adding so they match the backdrop. I'm going to keep it at 25% opacity for now. I'm going to grab a shadow over here by holding down Alt and with my brush tool, and I'm going to grab a dark part shadow on there, and I'm just going to brush it behind her. Play around with the size of the brush here. You want to feather those shadows out. And I didn't say this before I started, but obviously make sure the light is coming from the same way on your subject as it is on your backdrop. Okay, and now I need to add shadows to the floor as well. I'm going to go ahead and create another layer. Do your shadows on different layers so that way you can work with them individually. Multiply blending mode. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to grab a dark part of the floor with my holding down that Alt key again. It's just going to be a dark gray. Now sometimes I like to start at 100% opacity for these ones. And then I'm just going to use a smaller brush, and I'm going to go around the very bottom of her dress to add in those shadows there. You don't want to feather them back. You don't want a bunch of shadow up here because the light is coming from this way. So the shadows are going to be on this part of the image. You're going to have a very, very thin line of shadow right underneath her dress. But other than that, like I see a lot of people adding a bunch of shadow up here, that wouldn't be realistic. That shadow would not be there. And then if you did want to just darken the floor a little bit so that it blends in with the bottom of her dress a little bit more, again, would create a new layer, multiply blending mode, use a bigger brush since you're going to do the whole floor, do about 20% opacity, and then just brush that over the whole floor if you wanted. Then you can also play around with the opacity of it. It gives you a lot more control when you're not just trying to brush on and brush off using the subject. And then obviously we do not want the backdrop, even though she's close to the backdrop, we do not want the backdrop sharper than her. So I would just go to the backdrop. You can duplicate the layer if you want. That way you can change the opacity if you need to. Go to blur or filter blur, Gaussian blur, and very subtle because she's not standing very far away from it. So to make it look realistic, I'd do anything from 1.5 to 3%. Create a layer mask on your subject and just go around the edges with a small brush at 100% opacity, black, and just clean up any edges that need cleaned up here. And then what I like to do, which isn't always necessary, is go ahead and create a new layer. If you have a layer mask on your subject, go ahead and create a new layer and merge those two. That way you just have a flat layer again. I'm going to grab my blur tool and I'm going to blur the very edge of my subject.. That way She is blending, her dress is blending into the floor. The edge of her body has a nice fall off of depth from the edge of her body to the backdrop. And I would be done with this one. And you can, if you want to change the color a little bit of the backdrop, you could just go ahead and click on your backdrop layer, go up to adjustments and hue and saturation, and you can just slide that hue slider just a little bit if you wanted to change the color. You don't want to do it too much on these because it starts to change the color of the wall and the rod and everything else, and obviously we don't want that because that's not going to look realistic. But if you just need a slight change, you're able to do that. Okay, so I would be done with this one. We have good looking shadows. She's good in proportion. We added our blur to the backdrop. It's very pretty. Okay, next one. I'm going to do it the same way. I'm going to go up to my quick selection tool and select subject. I'm going to zoom in real quick and just check that. When it looks spotty here for the hair, I do not mess with it. Photoshop usually does a really good job of selecting flyaways. I can show you a little trick to fix that in case it looks like a little copy and paste. So I'm going to go to edit and copy, edit and paste into my image. I'm going to go ahead and resize her. And it's okay that her dress is sticking out a little bit. I just want her to be proportionate to the backdrop. Light is coming from the same way, so we're good there. If you zoom in, her hair, see, it copied and pasted those flyaways fine. Now, this is what I want to show you again. Since the color of the floor and the color of the backdrop are smooth and there's not much texture to it, we could possibly use the floor brushing on and brushing off. Let's try that real quick. I have not done these edits yet already, so this is also me just seeing what works best for my image as well. If I just go to select all, edit and copy, paste into my image, lower my opacity here, and resize. Okay, make that opacity, turn the opacity up again, go to my quick selection tool and select subject, and create that layer mask. That's going to take the background away. Okay, and then use our white brush on about 20%. Brush down here. You're going to more easily get back those shadows, so you don't have to add as much. But remember, you're going to be taking away that initial floor. So if you really liked how the initial floor looked, I would go back and I would just add in your shadows manually. But this can work for this backdrop. I would paint that back in so the backdrop doesn't go away on there. And now I'm going to actually create a hue saturation layer above her. And I'm going to create that clipping mask by clicking right there. And I'm going to drag down, I'm going to go to my cyans, and I'm going to drag that saturation down because I want the blues on her dress to better match the blues on the backdrop. As you can see now, it's not as vibrant, and it's the floor too is also matching the backdrop better. And then I would add the shadows in separately. I mean, you can try if you go to your brush and go to white again at 20% and see, you can see kind of how it looks if you were to brush it off. See, that's not really adding, since the backdrop, the initial backdrop was so much brighter, this is actually isn't adding any shadows. So it's another reason why sometimes it's just better to add them in manually, even though it can be a little bit more work. Just going to get rid of those. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, now that I have the floor the way I want it, I'm going to merge these two layers together, and it's just going to be her and the floor then. Then I can go in and I can go to my background. The shadows are done on the floor. We just need to do it on the backdrop. So create that layer, multiply blending mode, 20% opacity, use that Alt key on your keyboard, hold down and select a darker blue on the backdrop, and then go ahead and paint in your shadows. Okay. Looks like there's a part here. Now if you need to clean up the edges, make sure to create that layer mask on your subject. I'm not going to show it all for tutorial sake purposes, but 100% black brush and brush off those edges if you have if it's not subtle and you need to brush off a lot. You need to brush off right there. A lot of times though, you can just use your blur tool on edges like that and it will get rid of that line. Sometimes the blur is not enough and you have to go around and paint and you don't really have an option. But a lot of times just using the blur tool right on the edge can eliminate that for you. But same thing as the last image. Go around, add that blur, add that depth, get rid of flyaways. I was going to show you if you want to kind of add in, which this would be okay for her. I like to, if I need to add a little bit more, I create another layer above the background and I grab my brush at like size 3 or 4 and I hold down my Alt key and I grab the color of the hair by where I'm going to be working and I kind of just brush in some flyaways. And then I go up to my filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and see it looks like it's blending in right with her hair. It depends on how much blur you add. Like if you only add a little bit, you're still going to be able to tell that that was painted in. But if you add enough just to where it's as much movement and blur as the hair that's already in the image, that's the way you can add volume so it doesn't look copy and paste. I would also go in and on her face here and obviously clean that up on the edges as well, because you don't really want to just add blur to their face. Okay, so we added shadow with the first method, and then we added shadow on the backdrop with the second method. So you can absolutely use both if it works for the floor. If you're not losing texture or something you wanted from the digital backdrop, you can use both. Okay, last one. This is a wood floor on this one, and on this one it is a cement floor, so I do not want to try and blend them together on this one. So I am just going to go up to my select tool and select subject for this one. Make sure that everything is selected. Some parts of her dress here that it didn't grab, part of her earring that it didn't grab, and then some shadows on the dress that might be helpful to help us blend. Okay, edit and copy, edit and paste. Light is coming from the same direction, so we don't have to mess with that. Okay, now the yellows and the gold on the backdrop are a lot more prominent than the gold on her dress, so I'm just going to create a hue saturation layer above her. I'm going to go to my yellows and I'm going to increase, make sure you create that clipping mask. I'm going to increase the saturation just a little bit on her dress, or on her. You can brush it off her face and hands if you want to, but it looks okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and merge those layers. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer above that background to start brushing in my shadows. I'm going to I'm going to start at 100%. I'm going to grab a dark part by holding down that Alt key. I'm going to create this shadow first. This is her whole body. So this is a shadow that her whole body would cast from the light coming this way. And then I like to create a layer mask on that with my brush at about 20% opacity, black brush, and then just kind of dole in the edges there a little bit. And then lower the opacity on that shadow. That looks good. Okay, create another layer. Shadows on different layers, it helps. Zoom in. 100% opacity. Make a smaller brush here and brush in those shadows underneath her gown. Sometimes it helps to have the initial shadow, sometimes it doesn't, but in this case it's okay because it blends with the shadow that we're adding. And then you can lower the opacity on that just a little bit. I'm going to add another one because I want to darken the floor overall. I kind of want it to match the darker tones in here. Bigger brush, 20% opacity. And I just want to make that floor a little bit darker. Oops. Okay, so now there's not much light falling on this part of her dress as there is on the backdrop. So I'm just going to go up to her. I'm going to use my dodge tool on midtones, and I'm just going to highlight this part of her dress and her a little bit more to kind of get the highlights to match the highlights on the backdrop there. And a little bit deeper shadows. I'm going to go to my burn tool on shadows, and I'm just going to brush a little bit deeper shadow on this side of her. Okay, so with the way that this backdrop is, she's not right up against it. She's a little bit further away, but we might want to add just a little bit more shadow. At least we can try. Add another layer, multiply blending mode. This is going to be the backdrop, so now you want a dark color. Oh, sorry, go to your brush, 20% opacity, Alt key, and select that darker color. You can add just a little bit of shadow, but as you can see, it doesn't really make that much sense because of where she's standing. So I could do without it because she's standing all the way out here. As you can see, her shadow is all on the floor here. So we just want to add, since she's a little bit further away from the backdrop, you want to add a little bit more blur. But I also want the floor to still remain in focus. So I'm going to duplicate that background before I add the blur. Gaussian blur, I'm probably going to do about 3 here. Or maybe like 2.7. And then I'm going to create a layer mask on there. And zoom in. Use my black brush at 100% opacity and brush it off the floor so that texture comes back to where the field that she is standing on. Go up to her, and I'm going to blur that edge. So it falls off nice and evenly onto the depth between her and the backdrop. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to delete that shadow. Okay, I didn't do before and afters on my other ones, but before and after. Go ahead and merge that, and that's it. So there are different ways to do it. You will see different editing methods, but some are going to be better and easier to use than others. It just makes sense depending on the image you're using versus the digital backdrop that you're trying to use with it. If you have any questions, you can message me on Etsy. If you are a studio photographer, I would love for you to join my group on Facebook. It is linked in the description.